we head back to early 2023 in January. That's when UFC president Dana White informed us that the UFC had parted ways with the baddest man on the planet. That's UFC heavyweight champion Francis Ngannou. The MMA leader could not come to terms with Ngannou, but this time it wasn't just about the money. It was about freedom and respect. Ngannou wound up signing for the PFL while retaining the ability to pursue boxing, which was a long-time dream of the Predator. Though he didn't log any time, or sorry, I should say, so he hasn't logged any time in the smart cage. He sure as heck did in the boxing ring. His opponent, by the way, was none other than boxing heavyweight champion Tyson Fury. Everyone but Michael Salazar knows that one. Anyway, guys, the general reaction here. Who got the better end of this? Who won? The UFC or Ngannou? Goes?
I think Francis Ngannou was the true winner, of course. If you look at the ways that he won, there's just so many different things that kind of fell into place for him. He did ask a lot of the UFC, and I think part of that negotiation process with him, I think maybe the UFC could have bent on some other things. I think he made some things outrageous in hopes that they would just do the other stuff. But Francis Ngannou, I mean, he was able to not only fight for himself, but fight for all fighters, right? His opponents to get money. He was able to go do the boxing side, which absolutely worked out for him because early on you could say, all right, everything that they said when he signed, he's already a winner. But what if he goes over to boxing and he gets completely thumped, which a lot of people thought was going to happen. You're going up against a high level boxer, one of the greatest to ever do it. At that point, does he still carry the baddest man on the planet label, right? If he's over there and that happens to him. And he put up such a great fight that a lot of us just forget he lost the fight. He felt like the winner that night because of the way he fought. So many things just kind of fell in his lap that we all just didn't think would be possible. I do think he was the winner in that sense, but I think you can make an argument for the UFC winning to a certain extent. In when you think about the foothold that they put, they put their foot on fighters' necks, and maybe they were able to kind of hold on to that because if you give in to some of Francis Ngannou's demands, some of the things he wanted, that might work for Francis Ngannou, but guess what? The next guy's going to knock on the door and he's going to want the same thing. That's just happened repeatedly in the UFC. It's happened in our sport. And I don't blame fighters for wanting that. The first guy to not hold the belt and want pay-per-view points and all that, or the first guy to ask for a suite, all these little things, like they just happen. Fighters talk. Goes from one guy to the next guy. And if you give in to Francis Ngannou on some of those things, the next guy is going to start to ask for the same stuff. You look at Conor McGregor and some of the things he's been able to get away with and the effect that he's had on the rest of the roster. So in a way, I think you could say the UFC maybe won a little bit in being able to still hold that command over their fighters. But at the end of the day, Francis Ngannou was a massive victory for him.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, Mike, you've seen the whole year play out. This was like a year-long thing here that happened. Him, parting ways, getting signed. I think a future opponent gets $2 million. Obviously, it was too late for the season, so he wasn't a participant. We know he's going to be a pay-per-view guy. And then he goes out to Saudi Arabia and has that awesome performance in the boxing ring. How about you, man? Do you feel the same way? A lot of people do. And Ngannou won, but what about from the UFC side? Did they win at all?
Yeah, I think what Goes said there is pretty much like the only context if you want to spin an angle of the UFC somehow getting like a win. In this scenario, it's that they were able to maintain their status quo and not change the landscape and not give fighters a different type of leverage, yada yada. All those things Goes said. Those were good points there. But yeah, obviously Francis is the big winner in this scenario. This is more than a year-long story, right? Like this goes back to pretty much January 2021 or 2022, whatever it was, where he fought Ciryl Gane, and we all knew that he was kind of on the last fight of his contract, and there was going to be the sunset clause coming on. So this has been something that's been crescendoing for quite a while here, and then obviously it came to the point where they claimed they offered him the highest contract for a heavyweight besides Brock Lesnar or whatever the quote Dana White was, and then insinuated he didn't want to fight John Jones because it was too big of a risk. And then they finally kind of let him out of that final stage of, I guess, the matching period or exclusive negotiating period, whatever it was for his contract, which really gave him the freedom. So yeah, for Francis to walk out there with a UFC heavyweight title around his waist and then go do what he did. I mean, how many times did we talk about this? throughout the year rather. People criticizing him for leaving that money on the table, that Jones fight on the table, fumbling the bag, all these things that were kind of associated with him, and he basically proved everyone wrong in every sense. So yeah, this was a tremendous year for Francis Ngannou. I think he did show that empowerment for fighters can still exist. How many people can actually get there and replicate his circumstances? Probably not many. It was a very unique thing. And from the sounds of it, the UFC has kind of gone to take measures to prevent similar things from this happening in terms of adjusting the verbiage in their contracts and things like that. So yeah, we might not ever see anything like this again, the way Francis kind of played his cards here, because it doesn't seem like the same deck is going to exist for other people going forward. So yeah, big time stuff for him. And yeah, in terms of the performance, like what can you say? He went in there and shocked us all against Tyson Fury. And now it seems like something else as big is probably going to fall into his lap in 2024 in terms of maybe like a fight with, whether it's this mixed rules thing with Deontay Wilder, or maybe Anthony Joshua could be back on the table. That seemed to be the most appealing thing. So whatever it's going to be, he'll fight MMA at some point. It's going to be big stuff for him. And I think he's one of the few people outside the UFC that can actually herd an audience to come watch him.
Mm-hmm. All right, Nolan, how about you, man? Who do you feel got the better end of the deal with, Ngannou and UFC parting ways?
Yeah, not to be too repetitive, just because I kind of agree with everything that's been said so far. So I'll be kind of quick. But, obviously Francis, in terms of his battle, that battle was a big winner. He went on and not only got the fight, which I think a lot of people thought would be very difficult for him to do, to have an actual pro boxing match against Tyson Fury. That ends up happening. And not only that, but he goes out there and performs so well. A lot of people thought he won. So I think just that was literally probably the best case scenario for him across the board. Just unreal playing of cards that ended up materializing in something great. But to Mike's point, in terms of the UFC's whole portfolio, I don't think that in their whole roster and all their moving parts they have going on, it's going to take a lot more than that for just one fighter leaving for any sort of significant change to occur, for the UFC to be losing any sort of battle, the bigger battle, right? So we'll see if any other fighters kind of take into their back pocket and take this into their brain and say, hey, next year I'm going to try to advocate more for myself. But with the way that the contracts are structured and how often does that actually happen, it might not be necessarily realistic to think that this is something that's going to occur often. But that would, in changing the sport as a whole, it would have to happen quite a few times for, I think, the UFC to really truly start sweating.
Since most of us guys feel like Ngannou won this first round, I don't know if they're going to have more rounds or what, or won this fight versus the UFC, I wanted to ask you guys even more specifically, what do you think the UFC might either regret or just feel the biggest loss may have been because of the fact they're no longer associated with the baddest man on the planet? We'll go back to Goes here. Goes, any thoughts here on any regrets or just seeing the way it played out on what could have been?
Well, yeah, I mean, the John Jones fight would have been massive, right? And we always talk about, I'm here in Las Vegas, Georgia, usually here in Las Vegas, but that big old stadium, Allegiant Stadium, when you see all these big acts that come there, I imagine the UFC at some point wants to be part of that, right? And there's only a few fighters that could maybe carry something to happen there. And I would imagine Francis Ngannou and John Jones would be two of those.
Yeah,
I think that would have been a lot of fun, the matchup itself, whether it happened at the stadium or not. It going away, I think, really stings the UFC.
Mm-hmm. Mike, can you think of anything else where the UFC is like, damn, we blew it? Even though they might not, they're not going to be public about that. They're not public about their L's. They got to be feeling something here. We're all not stupid.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big fight that could have happened that they lost. I mean, there's been some super fights, or however you want to describe them, over the years that the UFC has failed to put together. And John Jones versus Francis Ngannou, assuming it never happens, is one that goes on that list of fights the fans never got. And I know Dana doesn't really trump that line out the same way he did earlier in his career. As we listen to the fans, we make all the fights the fans want, all that stuff, because it's simply not true anymore. Like, we've seen enough examples at this point to kind of poke holes in that argument. So yeah, I think that's obviously one of the key things here that would have done, I'm assuming, pretty well on pay-per-view, higher than I'm sure their average event if you had Jones and Ngannou fight. So like that would have been something that would have been good for them. I don't know if it was big enough to go in Allegiant Stadium, all that stuff, but it would have been a marquee fight and a huge one for the heavyweight division, and obviously would have maintained the lineage of the heavyweight title. Like now you have this whole broken up thing where you have Francis outside the UFC, John Jones is the champion, Tom Aspinall is the interim champion, and there's a good chance none of those three guys will ever fight each other, which seems a little ridiculous and backwards. So this was kind of the genesis of it. But do I think the UFC really cares? Not really. I don't think they're losing any sleep about it. I'm sure they see another John Jones fight in their horizon. Tom Aspinall is a good person to maybe take that over, whether he fights Jones or Stipe or not. So I don't think they're losing any sleep. I don't think they're kicking themselves, but I'm sure they know somewhere in the back of their mind that, given what Francis has done and all these things like that, they had a big fight there in their pocket that they didn't successfully make.
And what about, guys, what about the one that happened that they could have been a part of? Because I know we've talked about it goes, Mike, you reinforced the point. Hey, we stood our ground, only Conor McGregor can pull this off. But, there's some thought that maybe McGregor and someone like an Ngannou could pull this off. And not only did Ngannou show up better in the boxing ring than McGregor did, again, we all arguably thought he won. Could they have left money at the table? Every time Dana White comes out after pay-per-view, Mike, you've been to plenty of these, Nolan. The gate is 9 million, 10 million. His face is glowing. You guys mean to tell me that they wouldn't have made more than that? There's rumors that they made 50 million from the McGregor and Mayweather fight, that they wouldn't have made more than the 9-10 million than they do from a pay-per-view, just being a part of it and just promoting it. And they would have kept the guy that arguably almost beat Fury. No thoughts there on that one?
I mean, sure, they could have done it, but like, do they really care? The UFC is basically printing money at this point. So like, is that cut that they would have made? Like, sure, it would have been good, but is that worth, again, the potential fallout? Then you have Sean O'Malley being like, help me set up a fight with whomever, Gervonta Davis or Devin Haney or whoever he wants to call out. So like, again, it's the UFC wants to protect itself foremost over these type of things. And I think in some instances, they're probably willing to put money aside. Maybe if they had got Francis into like a, 6-fight deal, they could have done this somewhere, but they would have wanted to do Jones first. And if he had lost that, is a Tyson Fury fight even, feasible or something people would care about? So it's a lot of kind of trying to go through the history and make some revisions and, what ifs and stuff like that. But honestly, if you're Francis, especially, why would you want to do that? He got, the entirety of his payday instead of having to split anything with UFC. Maybe they could have helped promote it and made it a bigger fight or whatever, or a cleaner fight. We wouldn't have had to sit through an hour-and-a-half concert before the main event went down. But yeah, like I don't know. I think it worked out pretty damn well if you're Francis.
I think you have to remember too, our feelings going into that fight were a lot different. I think a lot of us were soured on what we saw there with Mayweather and McGregor. I don't know that everybody and their mother lined up to pay for this thing. I think a lot of us heard from other people, hey, this was actually a good fight. But going in, I don't know that there were that many people excited.
Yeah, I mean, we all thought he was going to get destroyed. That was the
well, fair point,
but
there is
happy
the
he
one
was going to
punch
make money.
power. Fair point, but there is the one punch power that heavyweights do occupy. Not that say that McGregor doesn't, but he was literally fighting the best defensive boxer of all time with zero experience. Not that Ngannou's got a ton, but at least he came through boxing before he became an MMA guy. But go ahead.
I was going to say, think about what he set up just in that one fight, because how many people want to see them fight again, right? And he could lose that one, but I think he's done so well that maybe even that Deontay Wilder fight, right, could be on the table. Anthony Joshua, like those paydays are absolutely massive, and they're only going to get bigger because of that performance. So Francis Ngannou has really laid the table nice for him here in the upcoming years.
And I say this from a position of being an a boxing casual. I do wonder if going forward boxing, the more hardcore boxing crowd will be more invested in Francis, like seeing him fight Wilder, seeing him fight Joshua, whereas the Fury thing, did they view it a bit as of a charade, right? Like, was this more for MMA, a boxing match for MMA fans, or was this a boxing match for boxing people? I'm not really sure, but I think going forward, he'll have that respect from the boxing community where, oh shit, Francis is, fighting Joshua or fighting Deontay, and he did that to Fury. Like, we got to watch this now. He's actually pretty good. So I think that's a big feather in Ngannou's cap going forward as well.